Okay, I think we're ready to get going. So thank you all for joining us today for the webinar of developing the world's first successful end-to-end battery passport pilot, experiences and lessons learned. I'm Camilla. I'm the Marketing and Communications Manager at RCS Global, and I'll be moderating today. Before we get started, and I introduce our excellent speaker panel, I'd like to cover just a few housekeeping topics. Today's webinar is being recorded. We'll be able to share a link with you after the webinar is complete. We welcome you to revisit the content and share it with colleagues who are not able to join. We also invite your comments and questions. Please look at the Q&A box at your screen. If you do think of a question for our speakers at any point, just type it in, then we'll be able to address them at the end of today's session at the Q&A. Today's webinar is being presented by RCS Global in collaboration with Souce. And the webinar consists of 4 parts. We'll start out with a panel discussion covering self-commitment, regulatory requirements and new generations of tools, asking questions such as how does the battery passport enable upstream and downstream stakeholders to implement sustainability policies along the value chain. We'll be welcoming Harrison Mitchell, co-founder and CSO of RCS Global, Pavel Zidenov, COO at Souce, Dr. Sven Jansen, Director of Government Affairs at Umicore, and Mark de Boer, VP Sustainability at Albemarle. In the second part, we hand over to Wouter Middendorf, Creative Director at Kryha, and Ian Fraser, Digital Solutions Lead at RCS Global, to talk about interoperability of systems, a track and trace approach. Then we invite Pavel and Harrison back to discuss next steps for battery passports for Souce and RCS Global. And then finally, we end on a Q&A session. We have a lot on the agenda today, so we'll kindly remind our speakers of time during the sections to ensure that we have some time for Q&A at the end. And now we'll just jump straight into our panel debate. So the EU battery regulation is just one of many regulations stepping into force, driving for circularity, transparency, and traceability. A critical element is multi-stakeholder collaboration, which is a core focus of today's webinar, as well as the interoperability of systems to develop successful digital product passports. I'll open this debate by handing over to Harrison Mitchell to tell a bit about why we're here today and RCS Global's journey and our work on battery passports. Harrison, over to you.
Yep, thanks very much, Camilla, and thank you all for joining this webinar. I hope we've got a really good hour of good discussion and insight for you today. So just a quick background on RCS. We were founded 16 years ago, and our expertise is certainly in the responsible sourcing space. And really our vision is a world where natural resources are produced, traded, and transformed in a way that generates sustainable, positive impacts on the people and the planet. We run the most widely used audit program in the battery industry, and that includes a lot of due diligence and ESG mappings and audits for battery materials. And we also have a lot of experience on the ground, for example, in certification programs in the DRC itself, where we run a very successful due diligence program in that difficult environment. Recently in 2022, we launched Fine, which is a database of companies in the battery supply chain with over 4,000 entities. And that's going to be a core part of our offering going forward. So I just wanted to quickly say why we're here working on the battery passport. It's clear from our experience, we're very supportive of responsible sourcing. And I think from our perspective, the battery passport has the potential to become a key tool for empowering and enabling responsible and sustainable value chains, right? If it's done properly, we will get a new level of transparency along the supply chain, and we will see a drive in sustainability performance through that increase in transparency. And so for us, it's really one of the key tools that we have available, I think, in the coming years to achieve our vision of having a positive impact on people and the planet. I think the final thing to say before I hand to the panel is we're very proud to be part of the Global Battery Alliance and to be one of the companies that issued one of the world's first battery passports, which was a pilot that was initiated and designed by the GBA in collaboration with many of the members you have on the panel today. And I think it was a really valuable experience that shows that there's a huge need to have collaboration, to have open collaboration, and to really work through some of these key issues around standards, processes, interoperability that we're going to discuss today. So yeah, I'm looking forward to our discussion, and thanks very much, Camilla. I'll hand back to you.
Yeah, so I think a good way to get started, because we've all here been a part of the pilot, going around and sharing maybe one of your key takeaways from doing the pilot, lessons learned going forward. I'll hand over to Mark first to share top key takeaways from working on a pilot and working on Battery Passport.
Yeah, so thank you very much, and good day, everyone. Key takeaways for us: we were very pleased to participate in this pilot as well. We welcome any possibility to create transparency in the supply chain. We also welcome the opportunity to show positive impact, because due diligence often focuses on risks and so on. So yeah, we were able to do so. One of the things we saw is that Albemarle is actually at the very start of the supply chain as a lithium supplier, as you probably know. We have very good visibility in terms of sustainability for social and environmental aspects. We're actually willing to share quite a lot more than the scope of this battery pilot in this stage. So I'll leave it at that at this moment.
I'll hand over to Sven then to pick up and add a few notes on that. Key takeaways.
Key takeaways, yeah. I think it's the battle of the brave here. I think it really matters to get started and to have the guts to just go and do it. I think there's a lot of talk, especially in regulations, and often we kind of miss the initiatives behind. So Umicore, as a sustainability champion, has always been kind of a front runner in all these approaches, certainly towards sustainable sourcing, but also sustainable recycling. And here, I think the key was that we get together and create an atmosphere of trust through these trials and demonstrators, and in it together, so that we have the opportunity to discover all, let's say, the similarities of the common ground with all our stakeholders, and build on those, rather than kind of hide behind the differences that we often use as an excuse to not do something. And here, I think it's getting familiar with the concept and the ideas of a battery passport, what it really means. And as always, the devil is in the details. And when you start doing something, you discover all these nitty-gritty things that you often more stumble with, rather than the overall big philosophy behind it. So that was, I think, a key takeaway for us. Just getting started, do it, and over the process, really build the trust with all the people that are involved. And that was a great experience.
Yeah, I have to agree with that, Sven. I think the trust building is crucially important, because some of this, although there's a technological element to this work, some of this is simply about having good relationships and trust between entities, because you're providing a lot of data. And I think that was one of the key takeaways for us, was that we, as RCS, because we issued the passport, was acting as a data exchange for all the data that was coming in from the respective parties. But actually what happened was there was a lot of trust that was, I think, engendered in that process between the group. And so people got a lot more comfortable with sharing information due to the fact they were participating in this together with the same objective.
To emphasize and work on that, Sven and I knew each other already. Albemarle delivering lithium to Umicore, and so we knew new partners in the supply chain. So indeed, it helps if you have worked with each other before, and if you have had already discussions about the supply chain, more in-depth discussion that you can cover in a set of data in a battery passport. Yeah, so absolutely that works that way.
Yeah, and I think it's a great opportunity to be kind of change agents here and really guide the industry and all people involved, also science, also all the other stakeholders that are involved, that need to be involved to develop the technology, to kind of guide them through the process. And it's a massive change process. We come from a totally different way of working, and we want people to change behavior, ways of thinking. We want to become circular in the way we do business, we live, we think. And I think that's a massive change process. And we're at the very beginning. So it's certainly a great thing to hear be a bit of a guide and help people go through this.
And I think it's quite interesting. So now you mentioned that it goes beyond, and it actually influences beyond just the work on the pilot and passport. How does the battery passport empower stakeholders to implement their own strategies in responsible sourcing and sustainable sourcing? How do you see it going in and influencing at a strategic level?
Yeah, that's I can make a start. Yes, of course. Since the last 5 years or so, I'm going to say 5 years, we've had an enormous wave of information requests coming in from all sorts of stakeholders, right? Our customers, customers, and NGOs, and so on. So, first of all, it's also about efficiency. Providing the same set of data only once and in a consistent and reliable way. We see typical for a young industry, many standards evolving. So and that's what we have to go through. So this hopefully helps us to streamline that set of information. And of course, it's about the standards around, for instance, carbon footprints. I think we'll talk about it a little bit more later on. Carbon footprints are so essential in a lot of emerging regulations, certainly within the EU, probably go around the world in the future. So we need to make sure that the standardization and the definition of those carbon footprints will be standardized.
Yeah, I think there is. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. Also, to piggyback on what Mark said in the previous discussion, one of the biggest takeaways and positive surprises for us was that, yes, we frequently talked about pressure from the regulators and changing the industry, but it was great to see for all companies across the supply chain, the upstream, the midstream, the downstream. It was also a lot of value that is being created by consolidating the data and by working on the battery passports, because it was not just a formal exercise to adhere to the regulation, but a lot of value created by mapping the supply chains, by understanding its ESG performance, by understanding where the industry and the companies can improve. That creates a lot of value for all of the players across the supply chain.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's an opportunity there to drive sustainability performance ultimately. I think that opportunity that you've referenced, Mark, is also the risk, right? So there is an opportunity with the battery passport to standardize all the reference standards effectively for our greenhouse gas disclosures and our due diligence, our human rights, assessments or sustainability criteria. There's also a risk that, with the GBA is only one of many initiatives that are out there looking at the passport or something similar. And I think there is a risk that we somehow fracture that opportunity into, many different standards as well. So I think that is where we need to take care and make sure that we try and align with line with the standard set that is accepted broadly, but that is also robust. Otherwise, we obviously, reduce the value of the passport itself. But I think that's a real interesting opportunity for our sector.
And applicable, not only robust, but also applicable. I think the practical point of view also needs to be stressed and emphasized, not only talking about regulation, because if we leave everything to regulation, we'll end up with problems. So it also needs to be applicable. We need to be able to do it. So it needs to be a hands-on thing, and it needs to be a balance between effort and benefits that it creates. So if it does not create business value, we won't buy in. So that is also something that is very important. And that is something where the awareness, I think, is created along the way. And as we go with use cases that we think of applicability in end-of-life consideration of the value chain as well. So it's not only about the supply side, it's also about everything that is kind of end of life of the battery. What happens? How do we get all these secondary materials into the game? How do we become really circular? And also not try to run the risk to apply a linear way of thinking just with a new regulation now. because the driver for digital product passports is to create linear circularity and go away from linear ways of thinking, and really think in closed loops and circles all the time, no matter what we talk about. And whether it's an element, whether it's a material, or whether it's a product, it always needs to be considered in how do we close the loop. So also when it comes to CO2, that we don't consider CO2 a kind of a waste. It's also something where we need to think about how do we put it back into the circle to be really climate neutral in the end. So also carbon circular economy needs to be created. All that is very complex. So that makes it so challenging, because we have so many things and so many different topics to deal with. But we need to start somewhere. And I thought that we're starting with greenhouse gas footprint and child labor index, human rights index in the proof of concept when we demonstrated in Davos was a very good start, but there's many more things to come.
I think it's interesting. So you mentioned also here, like regulations is one part of the thing and one piece of the puzzle. To what extent do you think regulations are a challenge for the sector? Which regulations will be hard to meet, and will it take some time to meet all of them? What do you see as some of the main challenges here? Not necessarily you, Sven, you talked about it, but I'll open it up. Mark, Pavel, Harrison, you as well.
Oh, that's sorry, Harrison, please.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so in terms of regulations, there's indeed a wave of regulations coming, mostly encouraging, I would say, for planet Earth, nevertheless challenging to see what it's going to mean. Think about taxonomy, think about eco-design, think about the upcoming Critical Raw Materials Act, but also think about sort of the repairing directives like the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism and so on. So as mentioned, it's important that we understand how this will be implemented, how this will be made practical. What does it mean for Albemarle, lithium content, recycled content? How do you calculate that, and so on? Because it determines how investment decisions are going to be made. Give you a specific example here. Albemarle is planning to build a new, what we call mega flex plants, one in the US, one in Europe, and the flex part relates to the fact that we're going to use recycled lithium in the next end of this decade and in the next decade. So we need to make those decisions now. These plans take 5 to 10 years to all develop in terms of resources and building. So we need to understand what the regulations mean to us for investment decisions.
Yeah, Harrison, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, it's a great point. I'm here in Japan actually today, this week, and you know, there's certainly a lot of consternation over here around the EU regulation. So what it's doing is driving adoption, right? But obviously it's something of a blunt instrument. And if you look into the devil's in the detail, as we've kind of discovered in this pilot, and so I think what has the potential to kind of go awry if we don't get the detail right, I suppose. But I think broadly speaking, it's really driving activity. So I think for us, what for the industry, as we're trying to do these passports, we need to get that balance right between what the regulation is trying to achieve and what is practical. Because some of the regulations perhaps don't understand the realities of supply chains. There's issues around confidentiality that we're going to have to overcome, data governance, etc. And you know, these are sticky and thorny issues that have to be really discussed and debated over the next couple of years as we continue to do the work.
And standardization would be a big topic. So for example, if we want to calculate the carbon footprint at the downstream, there are a lot of different methodologies that could be used to calculate the carbon footprint along the supply chain. So having the overview of the supply chain, having overview of all of the metrics, how they were calculated would benefit. But then ultimately, what would be the aggregation methodology, whether it would be decided by the industry through the industry efforts such as GBA, for example, or through the regulation. It's remain to be seen, but it's one of the challenges that we are facing. And that's one of the learnings from the pilots.
And I think also the, let's say, creating, so to say, a multi-stakeholder consensus that we kind of have initiated in these pilots. I think that's in the future very important for all the consultation processes that will need to be done prior to secondary legislation, when the battery regulation is becoming more concrete with all the delegated and implementing acts. When it comes to concrete carbon footprint thresholds, when it comes to recycled content numbers and all of that, I think that is very important that we have this dialogue with legislators to have a smart discussion about what is it that matters and how can we really put it into practice. So not only to be having an updated regulation. And I think battery regulation is an interesting and good example of kind of a waste regulation turning into an internal market regulation, applying a more systemic and life cycle approach. And the same for eco-design, for sustainable products regulation that is currently under revision. I think also their legislation needs to get smarter and needs to get more aligned, so that in the end, the battery regulation should not contradict the end of a live vehicle regulation or the waste shipment regulation. All of that needs to be aligned. That's a big thing to be done for over the next decades, I think. But it's great to have been part of the kind of initial steps in getting started and make it happen.
Right, and I think while EU regulations will ask suppliers of the automotive industry to cooperate and meet all these regulations and requirements, I think RCS is actually a really good example of where industry started to collaborate on tricky questions. Pavel, can you share some insights of the challenges you and the members have identified in the first place? Does the upcoming regulations add new aspects to these challenges, and how do you suggest that they are met from the midstream and upstream?
All right, thanks, Camilla. So just to recap, a RCS is a consortium like Glencore, CMOC, and the Eurasian Group, right? We started as an industry initiative to make sure that there are responsible sourcing practices in the cobalt industry, right? So that there are no risks in terms of, for example, human rights along the supply chain, and that we wanted to collaborate with both our midstream and downstream partners to give them this comfort and to push for improvement of transparency and sustainability of the cobalt supply chain. But as we work towards tracking and building a cobalt tracking solution, we realize there is incredible demand, not only for the cobalt tracking, but also to covering other battery materials, about not only tracking physical shipments of the metal and providing the proof of provenance for the metal, but also for the capture of ESG metrics along the supply chain. So you can say that RCS is an example that it started as an industry initiative to ensure the clean cobalt mining practices, but then it grew and expanded towards covering other metals, capturing ESG metrics, and ultimately creating a battery passport. I guess that would be a good example to share.
Right, thanks. And I think, Harrison, from your perspective, I mean, from RCS's perspective, we have the other side of things from the clients that we're dealing with. How do you see these challenges changing with the regulations coming and adding to what Pavel said?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think the regs are expanding the scope of what's traditionally due diligence has been focused on. Human rights, primarily. Now, obviously, in the battery regulations, especially, and even in others, German Due Diligence Act, for example, there is enhanced requirements around environmental impacts, but of course, greenhouse gas emissions is a big addition, and obviously that the requirement for traceability by default, really, in order to get the data is, I think, obviously that's something we do with our clients on a day-to-day basis, but it is something that is quite clearly a requirement now. So, yeah, I can see an expansion of scope of the work, frankly speaking, to incorporate these other items. But what we need to get better at, and that's obviously something that we're working on as well, is to improve the systems to enable that data flow between different parts of the supply chain. So, yeah, I'm sure we'll talk about that later with Ian and Walter.
Yeah, and Sven and Mark, from your perspective, being a part of the battery passport, and from your role in Albemarle and in Umicore, what are the main hurdles you see automotive sector and the battery industry will need to overcome, and which priorities should suppliers set now going forward?
The main hurdles, the main hurdle obviously is around standardization, agreeing on content. That's very simple. I say simple, and it is not simple, right? Because when I was thinking about this before this webinar, I said, yeah, the most difficult thing to do is to keep things simple, right? And that's indeed here the big challenge. It's about incorporating existing standards. It's relatively easy to set a standard for a greenhouse gas. How do you calculate carbon footprint? And even that is difficult. But how do you set standards around social aspects? Albemarle, for instance, is now being certified for IRMA, the responsible mining certification. That's very specific. But again, there's sets of questions around that. Would everybody in the supply chain adhere to that? Multiple standards for various partners along the supply chain. So yeah, again, standardization, keeping it simple, that's the big challenge.
Yeah, I mean, and if we look at, let's say, supply chain complexity, I mean, all the materials that end up in a battery from all over the world, we have very heterogeneous frame conditions everywhere. So standardization is a must, but it's very, very difficult to do it and to agree. So that is certainly one of the big challenges of getting that aligned. And that's the learning process that I mentioned earlier on. And in the end, create a level playing field so that we all stick to the same rules. And in the end, we all compete on innovation. And that's the ultimate goal, to do that. That's a long way to go, while at the same time, the industry needs to go through a complete transformation. So we have the change towards electromobility, and I think that's many things that the automotive world needs to do at the same time, and yeah, that's certainly the biggest challenge there.
But I think we have to acknowledge where there are good standards, right? So IRMA is one good example, but you're absolutely right that it's not going to be the one that everyone chooses or is able to do, right? But there are a selection of appropriate standards at the mine site level that we can reference. The challenge is, again, the standardization of different standards to each other, right? And yeah, it's a complex task. I won't, shy away from that. But I think we can get to an approximation. We might even be able to do something this year that's, getting to that point. I think the challenge for me, as I see it, I'm really interested in this, the comment about circularity. I think the post-consumer element is extremely opaque to me right now, and I think to a lot of actors. And we need to roll up our sleeves and get working on that with some additional pilots, frankly.
Right, and I am gonna cut the panel here because we are considering time. So thank you all so much. For anyone still having questions for Harrison, Pavel, Mark, and Sven, please pop them in the Q&A and we'll address them at the end of the webinar at a Q&A session. We'll now hand over to Ian and Wouter to talk about interoperability of systems. And I'll start by asking you both the question of how this collaboration came about and what is the deal with interoperability? Why is it so important?
I can start with that. Thanks, Camilla. So the importance of interoperability is, I think, quite simple. Especially now in the beginning, there probably won't be any single track and trace solution or single track and trace platform to rule everything, to rule the entire industry. So until then, that can mean two things. Either companies have to use multiple different systems and share data with all of them, or the platforms work together and interoperate to basically lighten the burden for companies to implement this and to share data. And in both options, in both ways, trust is key. Either trust of the companies in all the different solutions, or trust between the platforms. And I think right at Kryha, this is exactly what we do. We apply design thinking and address industry challenges through blockchain technology, and blockchain, right, is built for that trust. And that's, I think, also how we came here to this point, right? We joined the GBA. We worked on a pilot together with RCS, where Resource was tracking the cobalt materials. RCS was tracking lithium, and we need to find out how to combine data coming from those two different metals and issue a single passport. So basically, it was a deliberate choice to make it hard for ourselves, and see what that collaboration meant, and find out what data we had to share between each other, from the companies to our platforms, between the platforms, Resource and RCS. So it was a big challenge, and I think we dipped our toes into the water and learned a lot of things on what went well and what went wrong, and how to move this forward.
Yeah, just adding to that, I think it's quite interesting that in this battery passport pilot that we undertook, interoperability was actually the main thing that we were trying to achieve, along with obviously issuing a digital product passport. And I think both Kryha and RCS recognize that, and we've heard it in the previous contributions from the speakers, right, that people are looking for standardization and for comparability, and that in essence actually necessitates interoperability. So there are a lot of different solutions providers out there looking at the challenge of how to gather data across a complex value chain. But in this specific digital product passport pilot, we really took interoperability, as Walter says, really making it harder for ourselves from the get-go, because we understand that this is basically going to be a part of most future digital product passports, I think.
Right. And what were some of the key challenges you're trying to solve with going about the approach with interoperability? Say it's making it a little bit more tricky. Maybe a few more details on why you then chose this way?
I think the biggest challenge with interoperability is disclosure of data, right? And sharing data between platforms while remaining confidentiality. Whenever a company in the supply chain is implementing a solution like RCS Fine or Resource, there's a lot of trust between that platform and the company. Somehow, in case of interoperability, we need to extend that trust towards collaborating between platforms. So how do we do that, right? How do we share information without sharing sensitive data that companies are willing to share with those platforms? And again, there, right, we can use things like blockchain and zero knowledge proofs. But it is, I think that is the biggest challenge, to remain and keep specific data confidential, while sharing the necessary information in order to issue those passports.
Yeah, I think, Walter, you've already gone in the right direction here. I mean, one of the key challenges we saw in the pilot, and I think beyond, also based on our previous work, both as Kryha and RCS Global, is that companies are also concerned about data sovereignty. So one of the challenges is, how do we disclose what's required of us? How do we ensure that disclosure is aligned with what the standards or emerging regulations require of us, but also retain sovereignty of that data. And so in both solutions cases, we were looking at how can we pass on the information that's required, but not necessarily, a sort of blank check for open data, right? And this is something that comes up time and again. And I think to circle back to some of the key learnings of the pilot, trust here is extremely important, both trust among those entities that are looking to sort of be trailblazers and add a new dimension of transparency, but also among solutions providers, right? To trust the methodologies, the alignment, the interoperability of the two tools. And so I think coming back to your question on what is the major challenge, I think this data sovereignty is one of them, and then the trust, overcoming the trust barriers,
Great. And I think I just realized maybe, Wouter, you can explain there might be audience here not being super familiar with Kryha. So just a few words on the background of what you guys do.
Yeah, of course. Well, Kryha is a Web3 studio based in Amsterdam. Right, as I said, we address industry challenges and opportunities through Web3 and blockchain technologies. And in this light, we do that also for the Resource Consortium. We're founding advisor and product partner to Resource. So all the way from its inception, we've been working together to basically build the Resource platform and also make this pilot work.
Great, thanks. And finally, just going ahead, what are the next steps for interoperability within Digital Product Passport and that whole sphere?
Yeah, the next steps, I think we need to interoperate on an information level rather than a raw data level. But what information has to be shared, that can differ per supply chain or even per individual battery. So we need to find out in the coming months and years probably to understand really what information has to be shared in order to compile passports, and how do we solve things like double counting, or how do we make sure that everybody talks about apples if we're comparing apples with apples, right? In the case of industry standards. So it's really closer collaboration between the industry parties, but also between the solution platforms like RCS and Resource.
One other aspect I see coming up for interoperability in this digital product passport space is that oftentimes people kind of conceive of interoperability as a direct copying of the methodology and the data transfer, etc. But I think there will also be space for interoperability applying different layers of information that can be collected. So this could mean that one provider is tracking and tracing certain types of data, and another one provides another layer of this. So I think, as well as just this being a one-to-one, everyone doing the same thing, that there is indeed space for different solutions providers to play to their strengths and add a different layer of information to what's required for these complex passports. But I think the most important thing is to actually get out there and do it, right? So there is emerging standards and consensus around what we think is required, and to actually prove that this is possible. And so I think part of interoperating is the operating part, is that you actually need to actually get out there and start doing it and testing it. So yeah.
Great, thanks you guys so much. I think, considering time, we'll hand over to Pavel to talk a little bit about the outlook for Resource, next steps, and where we're going from here in terms of following the battery passport. So
Thanks,
Pavel.
Camilla.
Yeah.
So we, as a resource, as a consortium, see two major challenges that we would like to work with. First, we see an incredible demand from the industry, from the regulators, from all of the companies in the supply chain, and from its clients towards building a more transparent understanding of the ESG performance of the supply chains in the battery industry, and not only building a transparency, but also improving it. And the second challenge is just this creation of transparency and gathering all the information should be somehow formalized in the way of the battery passport, because as we discussed multiple times today, there are different standards, there are different methodologies on how to calculate different metrics, and how to formalize them, how to build an industry standard is the second major challenge that we are working towards it. So to solve these two challenges, we are doing several things this year. So first of all, we are focusing on onboarding more upstream partners, because we started as a cobalt, we did a pilot with the lithium, and then now we are working towards onboarding nickel, different lithium providers, and then the manganese, and ultimately working towards covering all battery metals. We are also in discussion with several midstream partners to not only cover upstream, but also incorporate the cathodes and the precursors manufacturing to create this coverage along the supply chain. And ultimately, we are working with one of our OEM partners towards implementing a first of its kind, full-scale issuing of the battery passports, which we hope will be maybe a big milestone for the industry. So if any of these challenges sounds familiar to you and top of the agenda for your company, then I hope we'll have a chance to discuss them and to discuss together what's the best way to solve them, right? So we can build more sustainable and transparent industry together. Thanks, Camilla.
Thank you so much, Pavel. And I'll hand over to Harrison to also share RCS perspectives on next steps following the battery passport pilot.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the interesting discussion. I don't think it's going to be any surprise to anyone that we will also continue our work on developing a battery passport. I think really now is the time when we need to have different initiatives, different alliances, different stakeholders really getting together and developing different products and approaches. So from our perspective, we'll be launching this year a new program effectively, which is called Claritas, which stands for Clarity and Clearness. And basically what we intend to be working on is a combination of digital infrastructure and real world certification of entities in the supply chain. And part of that is trying to obviously solve the issue of audit fatigue or multiple assessments on the single supplier, but also trying to standardize the output that comes from each company in the supply chain. We're really keen to explore decentralized identity because we think it's an avenue to providing data sovereignty, reducing complexity and promoting interoperability, right? So it allows each of the companies to have their control over their data. But we also need a data infrastructure to ensure data security and confidentiality. And so we'll be building that on top of our Vine platform as well, and issuing passports on the back of that. So we'll be working with our partners in our current programs, of course. And I welcome anyone who's interested to approach us and join in the work in 2023, of which there is going to be an exciting and very interesting journey as we continue to work this out. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, and thank you all for your great contributions. We have a few questions, and I see we have some time. The first question: which concrete questions would you recommend addressing next through the GBA multi-stakeholder partnership, and how, based on your experiences?
That question comes from a certain leading member of the GBA there, Torsten. So thank you for that question, Torsten. I'll hand it over to our panelists, though.
I think one of the biggest benefits that GBA provided during the pilot was a guidance on the standards. So time and time again, we're talking about standardization of methodologies. So building on the pilot, further expanding standards towards coverage of different metals, so different use cases, different ESG metrics, building standards on data interoperability and data sharing, also on top of the privacy and antitrust compliance, I think would be a big benefit for the industry to have from the GBA.
Great, thanks, Pavel. Mark, Sven, any?
What I would add to that is yes, standards very helpful in terms of proceeding. I would say let's try to walk or even crawl before we run, and let's try to do several of these pilots and involve additional partners in the whole supply chain, involve parallel pilots to repeat and make sure it is repeatable. It is trust. It is about building trust, as Sven mentioned earlier, and also make sure that more people get acquainted to the process, get comfortable with it before we try to expand the scope. That would be my main recommendation in this stage.
I would absolutely agree with Mark. I mean, it's reaching out to most of the players and give them, share the experience and go through the same process, and each time learn something, work on extended pilots with let's say next points, topics like water pollution, things to add. I mean, there's a long list of things that are to be addressed. Which one is next? Well, I think we need to discuss from pilot to pilot. It will depend. I don't think it applies. The same thing applies for everybody. So I think if many pilots are out there probing different things, I think the learning curve gets even more steep. I think that is really to be kind of multiplicated and accelerated now, and have as many as possible and do them in a good way, also in a good way of run the process, facilitate the gathering of data. We've seen that it was not easy. I mean, we had many calls where we looked at each other and not understanding exactly what was the next step. So it's learning. So I think the more we have, the better it will be, and the more we will multiply the experience and develop best practices in how to do it.
Yeah, I would agree. I think GBA needs to finalize what it is going to be going forward. That's a key question. I think that's and in my opinion, from our perspective, I think this industry-wide body that provides clarity on the standards and approaches is a very good option. There are sticky issues around data governance that really need to be debated in a forum like the GBA. So I hope that's something that can be tackled. But yeah, as the other panelists have said, we need to continue to do this work. So I would encourage the practical application effectively as a priority.
I can add one other thing. I saw a comment in the Q&A chat of somebody from a bank, finance sector, and said, "How can we help?" Well, this exactly is another element to it. We're doing this for a reason. We're doing this for people to get transparency through the supply chain in order to make decisions about investments and so on. So in this stage, it's also important to get basically the customers of this pilot involved, and give them a chance to opine on what's happening and see if that fits the purpose in the end.
Great. Thanks. Another question is, we actually have a number of questions around blockchain. Wouter, I'll direct this one to you. I think you're best fit to at least give it a go. So what blockchain was used in the pilot? This person is curious to understand what change management a major challenge to bring all entities into the one network? Is that case study available on this pilot work?
Maybe I'll take this question. Sorry, Wouter.
It's okay.
For the sake of time. We used a private Ethereum blockchain. Answering the question on the cost is actually a very cost-efficient way. Why we use the blockchain solution is because there are a number of data challenges related to the transparency of the data. Yes, we want to gather information along the supply chain, but at the same time, we need to share it in a secure way to comply with the antitrust regulation, to protect the commercially sensitive information. We, together with our partners, Kryha, built a zero-knowledge proof solution to share the data without disclosing the origin of the data. In terms of change management, they're actually not that much different from just working with an Excel and emails. And blockchain is just a tool. So it has its advantages, it has its limitations. But maybe going forward, as Harrison mentioned, we'll move towards data sovereignty, that each company will own its own data, and then we'll share how to, we'll choose how to share it, right? But that's, again, one of the challenges for the industry on how to build standards of data interoperability and how to make them practical, how to make them work.
Great, I think, and following up to that, and there's another question, because I think that's a general concern is cost of blockchain. There's a perception that cost is very high. Do you guys think there'll be this trend around blockchain, or just using Excel plus on-site audit reports to collect data, where would that be enough?
I can mention, for example, resource now covering and tracing 100% of the cobalt produced by the consortium, like Glencore, CMOC, and Eurasian Resource Group. I think that's like 70% of all the cobalt mined in the world. And I can say that the cost is like extremely manageable. And I'm pretty sure that just hiring an army of interns or analysts to crunch the Excels and work through the emails will bring first more costs and more complexity in terms of management implementation, and we have a much more efficient way to scale it rather than just going old school with the Excel and emails.
Yeah, indeed, I'm not sure Excel and emails is the way to go. Look, I think blockchain has its place for sure, because where there is a trusted network that can work together and communicate between them, I think that's a very good one. You know, what I worry about slightly is extending a network to parts which don't want to cooperate so much. And to kind of answer that question, even though, you know, a part of our work is indeed good old-fashioned Excel and on-site audits, there's part of the world that will only accept that, right? Or there's parts of the world that will stay in that way for a long period of time, frankly speaking. So I hope we can get to something more efficient than that through, you know, a combination of technology, obviously, which might be blockchain, might be other things. But yeah, I think we need to also acknowledge that there are different parts of the world that are crucial to this part of the supply chain, or the supply chain that may be reluctant to go down that route as well.
Harrison, I have to answer to this. Yes, indeed, we do have a solution for the partners that don't want to commit the data. So indeed, that as Pavel demonstrated, we're working towards an interoperability and covering different use cases.
I would expect so, Pavel. Yep, good.
I think there's also another question. I can see it was answered written, but I think it's interesting to post to the panel as well. Could this initiative be mirrored in the field of solar panel supply chains? And in general, expanding this beyond just, we are focusing on battery passports, but we're also talking about digital product passports in multiple fields. It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that, and also overlaps, lessons learned, similarities going on in the industry. So, and I saw you nodding.
Yeah, I think I can answer this. I think yes, this can basically how this pilot was designed and how the pilot was set up. Its architecture is applicable to basically any type of product or any type of supply chain, right? It comes down to mapping companies in a supply chain based on tracking or tracing material. and then letting those companies individually report on certain sustainability metrics. And then with that, gathering that, compiling that into a single passport with calculated sustainability scores and averages. So I think that applies, that can almost one-on-one be applicable to solar panels. Of course, it's a different supply chain, and there will be different companies involved, but the mechanism and its design and architecture is quite similar.
Yeah, transferability is of course is there, and it's also intended. So absolutely, there's other regulations that ask for digital product passes, like the Eco Design for Sustainable Product Regulation. There's also other initiatives. There is the German Battery Pass Consortium that is working on the battery pass kind of master data blueprint mechanics. We have Surpass, a European Commission-driven initiative, also dealing with batteries, but also looking at textiles and electronics and developing prototypes of digital product passes. There we have initiatives like Catena X. I mean, I'm not sure whether everybody has heard of it. It's about the entire automotive ecosystem, how data exchange is enabled there. There's also a link with battery pass work to use kind of the same underlying model of information. So what do we mean with a battery? So kind of a single point of definition, and so that is absolutely key and intended to transfer the findings and mechanics of the example of batteries to other complex products.
Yeah, 100%. It has to be, right? And you know, we already do at RCS a lot of supply chains that are not in the battery supply chain, other materials as well. So it's totally transferable to that. And I think actually, I mean, what's interesting is Battery Pass was doing it first, but you know, the way the EU regulation is going and the noises from the EU in general is that they are looking at multiple sectors to implement this passport approach.
Great, thanks. I think we have time for one last question. It's going to open up a few thoughts, I think, but we'll see if we have time. Due diligence, how is that tracked and reported via Battery Passport? I think I'll hand over to Harrison first.
Yeah, I mean, these questions are also about artisanal mine production in the DRC. So we did have material from the DRC, but not artisanally mined material. So it was all industrial scale material. And I'll defer to the Kryha chaps on the due diligence or the traceability item there. But just to kind of give the context for what the battery passport data is doing, or the data hoovering is doing, is that you're getting traceability in some fashion, either from a supplier to supplier format or from material traceability, the material itself, and you're applying ESG performance criteria against each supplier, right? So that's how you're doing your due diligence to ensure that the supplier is indeed a responsible producer, and you're getting that traceability all the way up to the end of the supply chain. But Kryha, obviously, you know, feel free to jump in, you guys.
No, I think you answered the question very well, right? The way we track, we can track in many different ways. Especially in the DRC, we do that on a physical level. So we track physical material in real time through QR codes, RFID solutions, etc. And once, right, traceability and tracking material is only a means to an end, right? Once you know where material is coming from, then you can actually also, as a downstream player, do your right due diligence, right? And know what the origin is in order to reach out to that origin and see how they operate.
Right.
I want to recall what Mark said, that we need to crawl before we fly, right? So understanding what materials is coming from non-audit sources, or what parts of the supply chain do not adhere to specific companies like the downstream or midstream ESG requirements or risk profile, is already a huge improvement. And we've talked with our partners in the downstream. They see a lot of value in just understanding which parts of supply chain present risk, which need more coverage in terms of audits. So I think we'll take it step by step, right? First, creating a transparency, and then working towards improving ESG performance in critical parts of the supply chain.
Great, thanks. I think we are at the top of the hour. I can see the multiple other questions coming in. We will be reaching out to you, addressing some of these questions. We, from RCS perspective, I can see there's a lot about ASM, and we do have a lot of experience with that. We'll also circulate them in case our panelists interested in replying to some of the questions via email. But I want to say thank you so much to all our panelists joining today, and to all participants for taking the time and joining in and listening. That's really appreciated. And I wish you all a lovely day.